there was understandable shock when we were told that Frans du Toit and Theuns Kruger, the two men who were found guilty of abducting, raping, and stabbing Alison Botha over 30 times, they thought she was dead. If they'd realized she was alive, they would have killed her. Luckily, they thought she was dead and they left her, and she survived and has fought an incredibly brave fight ever since. So when we learned that they had been given parole, wow, how could that be? And the Correctional Service Minister, Pieter Groenewald, said, well, I have certain powers in this regard, and after having had a look at the situation, I am going to use those powers and I am overturning that parole decision. And he justifiably got applause for that. But it does leave the question of how it is that two people so seemingly obviously unsuited for parole were granted parole in the first place. That's something that legal journalist Karen Maughan has been looking into. Karen, good afternoon. What did you find?
I mean, the record that was filed by the Department of Correctional Services in response to Alison Botha's litigation, which we have to stress was the impetus behind Minister Groenewald making what I would argue was the right decision on this, reveals startlingly that the psychologists, the clinical psychologists that were evaluating both men, found that Frans du Toit, was at high risk of reoffending, was a self-confessed serial rapist who couldn't actually determine a numerical value for the woman that he had raped. He was ultimately convicted of raping 3, one of whom was a pregnant woman that he raped 2 weeks before with Kruger. They attacked Alison Botha, and as you rightly point out, nearly killed her, stabbed her over 30 times. So there are major red flags raised in those psychological reports. He admits, du Toit admits to being a 28th gang leader. He boasts about the fact that he's a koning or a king in the gangs, and he also boasts about his so-called sexual prowess in actually raping Alison Botha. So in all the parole records that I've ever read in my life, and I've read a few, this is the most appalling. And I can't for 1 minute fathom how anyone would have thought that granting parole to people who are serial offenders in the line of serial rapists would be a good idea.
Is there anything on record? Does there have to be something on record about why the parole committee that adjudicated this came up with the decision that they did?
So the rationale that they give is that, there has been progress with both these men, that they've seen psychologists. In du Toit's case, he participated in a gang leaders workshop, as it were, and he then said that he'd converted to Christianity and, was now a reformed man. But the record doesn't show him, ever sort of demonstrating genuine remorse for what he and Kruger did to Alison Botha. In fact, exactly the opposite. At one point, he told the psychologist that, essentially she'd been able to help all these rape victims because they'd raped her. And some good...
So I did the world a favor by raping and nearly killing her. Okay, that's an interesting
And
take.
I mean, the thing is, we have to realize in South Africa, because of the minimum sentences legislation, which, listeners may or may not be aware, was introduced in the 90s, where South Africa was having this insanely high violent crime rate, and there was this desire by the legislature to try and address it. Minimum sentences were then imposed on particularly heinous crimes, and we went from something like 400 people serving life sentences in the 90s to now well over 20,000. So our prison system is overwhelmed by the amount of people serving life, and they need to deal with that. But I think that, what this story has exposed is that the process of dealing with that and granting parole in certain circumstances has serious flaws. And we also know, I was going through records, there have been a number of incidents. The Carmen Groos matter, Tasnee van Wyk. Tasnee van Wyk was 8 years old when she was murdered by a man who'd been released on parole. And there are real instances. The Lusikisiki massacre of 18 people recently, also a parolee. And so, when Alison Botha says in her representations to the parole board, I have real fears about my safety, it's embedded in the fact that we have this horrific record of people being released on parole by that system and then going out and perpetuating incredible violence against other people. And I think that's the issue that we should be looking at, not necessarily giving too much space to the fact that, the correctional services authorities are just saying, look, we're overwhelmed and we need to find space within the system. There has to be a completely new discussion about this, and the focus needs to be on the safety of the community, not necessarily on the overcrowding issue.
It's also so that a lot of people have been let out on bail. I mean, there are too many instances, people let out on bail, and then they commit a similar or worse crime than the crime for which they were originally charged. And as a sort of matter of principle, Karen, and I suspect it might be the same for you, one wants to keep open the possibility of rehabilitation. That it is and must be thought to be possible that people can genuinely reform as a result of having been sentenced for their misdeeds. But I'm not sure that it's a 50-50 split. It's got to, as you indicated earlier, come down primarily in favor of the community's needs and fears rather than on the need of a notional system of rehabilitation needing to be seen to be believed.
And that's why things like psychologist reports are so important, because a clinical psychologist is trained to sit there and interview and ultimately will provide an informed opinion, one would hope, on whether the person has genuinely shown, really turned over a new leaf, taken responsibility. And in the case of Du Toit, where the clinical psychologist says of the 22 risk factors that we can identify, he has 20, and you still in your wisdom decide that, we're going to release this guy, then I think, then we all have to have a long, hard look. And I mean, the other tragedy of this is that Alison Botha, this only happened because Alison Botha litigated. How many other cases where you have serious violent offenses, where oftentimes the victims are impoverished, don't have access to legal representation, might not even know that the person that attacked them or harmed their family member is up for parole. They just kept out of that process, and those people then get out and perpetuate potentially further violence. I mean, it can't be, and I think a lot of South Africans often feel like the justice system is almost weighted against victims. But in this particular instance, in Alison Botha's matter, that's been shown to be the case. And thank God for Minister Groenewald's wise decision on this. But God knows how many other people don't have that intervention and now have to live in fear.
Yeah. Look, I'm so glad I'm not part of a parole committee, because if I sit there and the offender goes down on their knees and, you see, expressing remorse, I mean, I don't know if expressing remorse is a necessary precondition for parole to be granted. In the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it wasn't necessary. There were certain bars that you had to cross. You had to convince the committee that there was a political motive to the crime that you committed, and you had to convince them that you had given all of the information that you had about that. Remorse was a nice to have, but it wasn't a necessary precondition. And so I don't know what the situation is when it comes to parole for a criminal, but I would think it's got to be something which is seriously considered. How sorry are you for what you did? Tell me about your understanding of the wrong that you did. And if you don't get satisfactory answers to those two questions, then you must be thinking, not so sure we should be letting you out.
Well, the ultimate truth is that if you genuinely take responsibility for what you've done, and you genuinely realize the incredible harm that you've caused to people, you are much less likely to perpetuate those kind of actions again. So remorse is an indicator, as one of the things that they consider in the risk factors. But ultimately, the parole authorities need to make a decision about whether someone, if released, will pose a threat to society. And unfortunately, the overwhelming kind of perception around potentially serial murderers like a Moses Sithole, who murdered 38 people, station strangler, etc., and serial rapists, is that they are beyond the arc of kind of redemption and rehabilitation, and that ultimately there should be a decision that that their parole applications should be denied. But obviously that's a hard call, and it needs to be one that is made by suitably empowered and intellectually enabled people who know how the system works, understands the character of the person before them, and makes a decision that can ultimately keep all of us safe.
News 24 legal journalist Karen Maughan, thank you very much for talking to us this afternoon.